The afternoon sun, usually a gentle balm, turned the windows of Rosie's diner into dazzling, fractured kaleidoscopes as the distant rumble began. It started as a low thrum, a vibration felt more in the bones than heard by the ears, growing steadily into a growl that swallowed the diner's usual hum of clattering dishes and murmured conversations. Outside, the air shimmered as a line of chrome and leather pulled into the gravel lot, dust pluming behind them like an advancing storm. Inside, Lily, lost in a vibrant world of crayon-colored princesses and castles, didn't notice at first. Her small tongue peeked out from the corner of her mouth, a sign of intense concentration as she struggled to keep the purple crayon within the lines of a unicorn's mane. Grandma Rose, however, paused mid-sip of her iced tea, her gaze drifting towards the entrance. Her lips, usually set in a soft, encouraging line, tightened almost imperceptibly. She knew that sound. Everyone in this part of the county knew that sound. The heavy oak door swung inward with a faint groan, and the diner's easy rhythm hitched. A draft of exhaust fumes and something metallic, like stale gasoline and worn leather, wafted through the air. 4 figures, silhouetted against the blinding afternoon light, filled the doorway. They were big men, clad in denim and dark leather, their movements deliberate and unhurried. The patches on their backs, a snarling eagle clutching a wrench, were unmistakable, the Iron Hawks. A hush fell over the diner. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Whispers died. Even the sizzle from the grill seemed to quiet. It wasn't an aggressive silence, not yet, but one of cautious respect, a collective holding of breath. Rosie's diner was a sanctuary of comfort food and local gossip, not usually a waypoint for the Iron Hawks. Grizz at the front scanned the room with eyes that missed nothing, even as his expression remained unreadable. His gaze swept over the occupied booths and scattered tables, resting for a moment on the counter, then moving on. Knuckles, a burly man whose arms seemed to stretch the seams of his leather vest, trailed behind, his eyes equally sharp, though a faint smirk played on his lips. He always enjoyed the initial quiet. It was a testament to their presence. Grandma Rose subtly shifted her chair, placing herself a fraction more between Lily and the newcomers. Her hand, worn from years of work, settled gently on Lily's shoulder. "Almost done with that rainbow, sweet pea?" she asked, her voice calm, a low current of reassurance beneath the sudden quiet. Lily, finally looking up, blinked her large, curious eyes. The change in the diner's atmosphere was palpable, even to her. Her gaze, innocent and unburdened, fixed on the men. They certainly looked different from the usual farmers and truckers who frequented Rosie's. Their leather jackets gleamed, and the boots they wore seemed impossibly heavy. Grizz's eyes, still surveying the room, softened almost imperceptibly as they landed on the small girl coloring. He had a niece about her age, and something about the intense focus of a child with crayons always tugged at a rarely seen corner of his gruff exterior. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his lips, a fleeting gesture of quiet amusement. But to Lily, it was not a smile. It was a flash of white in a bearded face, a sudden movement from a large, imposing figure. Her breath hitched. Her small hand, clutching the purple crayon, trembled. Her eyes, wide and suddenly filled with a primal fear, didn't leave Grizz's face. Specifically, they didn't leave the large, intricate tattoo peeking out from beneath the sleeve of his denim jacket, just above the wrist. It was a serpent, coiling around a dagger, its scales detailed with a dark, almost menacing artistry. "Lily, what is it?" Grandma Rose asked, her voice laced with concern. She followed Lily's terrified gaze, her eyes narrowing as she saw where it landed. Her own heart gave a sudden, uncomfortable lurch. That tattoo. She'd seen similar designs before, not often, but enough to know they weren't just decorative. Lily's lower lip began to tremble. The color drained from her face, leaving it ashen. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, as if to make the image disappear. But when she opened them again, it was still there. The serpent, the dagger, the dark swirling lines. That's the bad man's mark, Lily whispered, her voice barely audible, a fragile thread in the suddenly cavernous silence of the diner. Her small finger, still stained with purple crayon, lifted and pointed, wavering slightly, directly at Grizz's tattooed forearm. That's how I knew he was bad. The words, though barely a whisper, cut through the quiet like a razor. The air in the diner thickened, becoming charged with an unspoken tension. Grizz, who had been about to step towards an empty booth, froze. His half-smile vanished, replaced by a deep furrow in his brow. Knuckles, who'd been leaning against the doorframe, straightened abruptly, his eyes snapping from Lily's terrified face to Grizz's arm, then back again. Grandma Rose gasped, pulling Lily closer, her arm wrapping around the child protectively. Her gaze, fierce and unyielding, met Grizz's. There was accusation in her eyes, a raw, protective fury that belied her usually gentle demeanor. Grizz's jaw tightened. He knew his tattoos could be intimidating, but he'd never seen such profound, visceral terror in a child's eyes before, not directed at him. His gaze dropped to his forearm, to the serpent and dagger, a symbol he'd carried for decades, a mark of loyalty and belonging. To him, it represented brotherhood, a code. But to this small, trembling girl, it was something else entirely. Something dark. Something bad. Knuckles, ever quick to react, took a step forward, his hand subtly going to his side, then stopping as Grizz subtly, almost imperceptibly, shook his head. This wasn't a fight. This was something else. Something far more unsettling. Lily began to cry, soft, choked sobs that racked her tiny frame. She buried her face into Grandma Rose's side, her small hand still pointing. A silent, damning accusation. The purple crayon, forgotten, rolled off the table and clattered softly on the tiled floor. The diner remained utterly silent, every eye fixed on the interaction, every ear straining to catch the next whisper, the next clue. The Ironhawks, usually masters of any room they entered, were suddenly at a loss, their usual swagger replaced by a profound, uncomfortable bewilderment. Grizz, the immovable object, found himself standing in a spotlight of fear and accusation, his tattoo suddenly feeling heavier, colder on his skin than it ever had before. What did she mean? What bad man? The question hung in the air, a chilling prelude to something far more sinister than a quiet afternoon interrupted. The bad man's mark. The diner's hum of conversation evaporated, replaced by the clatter of a dropped spoon. All eyes, wide with confusion and a flicker of unease, fixed on Lily. Her small finger, still stained with crayon dust, trembled as it pointed at Grizz's arm. The serpent and dagger, a symbol of brotherhood and protection to him, was now, in her innocent eyes, a brand of terror. "That's the bad man's mark," she whispered again, her voice barely audible, raw with an uncomprehending fear that clawed at the edges of Grizz's composure. He felt a strange lurch in his gut, a mix of bewilderment and a dull ache. This wasn't the reaction he'd ever gotten from a child, not for their club's colors. Usually it was curiosity, sometimes awe, never this primal, bone-deep terror. Grizz glanced down at the intricate tattoo, a permanent declaration of his allegiance. The image was clear, unmistakable. A coiled viper, its fangs bared, wrapped around a gleaming dagger. It was a common enough motif, but their club's version, with the specific curve of the serpent's tail and the angle of the blade, was distinctive. He looked back at Lily, whose small face was now contorted in a silent struggle against tears. Her eyes, magnified by the burgeoning wetness, darted between his arm and the faces of the other Ironhawks, searching for something he couldn't decipher. A low murmur rippled through the club. Knuckles, usually quick with a sardonic comment or a hearty laugh, stood frozen, his jaw slack. He looked from Lily to Grizz, then back again, his brow furrowed in a deep V of confusion. The air in Rosie's diner, previously thick with the smell of coffee and frying bacon, now felt heavy, charged with an unspoken question. Lily's lower lip began to tremble uncontrollably, and a single tear traced a path down her flushed cheek. "He had it," she choked out, her voice cracking. "The bad man. He had that mark. On his arm." She pointed again, more emphatically this time, her small body trembling. Grizz knelt slowly, bringing himself to her eye level. The movement was deliberate, meant to be non-threatening. He kept his voice low, a gravelly rumble that usually soothed. "Who, darling? Who had this mark?" He extended his arm slightly, turning it so she could see the tattoo clearly. A silent invitation for her to look, to confirm. Lily squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head vigorously. "He was mean," she sobbed, the words tumbling out in a torrent of childhood trauma. "He took me from the park. He said I had to be quiet, or he'd hurt Mommy." Her small hands balled into fists, pressing against her eyes as if to physically push away the memory. "He kept me in a dark place for a long time." The words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow to the silence. Abduction. Dark place. Mommy. The implications were chilling, unthinkable. Grizz felt a cold dread seep into his bones. His gaze swept over the stunned faces of his brothers. Knuckles' face had hardened, all traces of confusion replaced by a dangerous glint in his eyes. "A dark place." Knuckles' voice was a low growl, a stark contrast to his earlier jovial demeanor. "How long, Lilybug?" He took a step forward, his massive frame radiating an intimidating presence, but his eyes were fixed on the little girl with a profound, almost paternal concern. Lily uncovered her eyes, fresh tears streaming down. "Days," she whimpered, her voice barely a whisper. "And there were other kids. He had them too. He had the mark, just like yours." She looked at Grizz, her expression a mix of terror and a fragile, nascent trust. "That's how I knew he was bad. Because of the mark." Grizz felt a sickening lurch. Other kids. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was something far more sinister. And the tattoo. The exact same tattoo. It couldn't be a coincidence. Someone was using their club's symbol, their mark of brotherhood, to commit unspeakable acts. A wave of righteous fury, cold and sharp, washed over him. Someone was defiling their colors, tarnishing their name, preying on the most vulnerable, and doing it under the very emblem they stood for. The thought was an affront, a desecration. Knuckles let out a choked sound, half growl, half expletive. He looked at Grizz, his eyes blazing. "A goddamn imposter," he snarled, the words dripping with venom. "Using our mark to hurt kids." The other Ironhawks, their faces a grim tableau, exchanged glances. The confusion had evaporated, replaced by a shared understanding and a simmering rage. Their code, their brotherhood, was built on protection, on justice, however rough-hewn. This was an abomination. He said he had friends, Lily continued, her voice gaining a fragile strength as she recounted the horror. He had a different mark sometimes, too. A skull with wings. But this one was always there. And he went to different houses. He took different kids from different places. Her small hands gestured vaguely, encompassing a world much larger than Rosie's diner. Grizz's mind raced, piecing together the fragments. Multiple victims, multiple locations. A predator, cunning and systematic, using a variation of their club's tattoo as a twisted calling card, a tool of deception. The winged skull tattoo was their main patch, their central emblem, but the serpent and dagger was a common secondary piece, often earned through acts of loyalty or bravery. Someone was mimicking it, or perhaps had a stolen patch, using it to gain access, to instill a false sense of security, or, in Lily's case, to instill fear. He reached out, his large hand gently cupping Lily's cheek. Her skin was soft, warm, and her tears felt like fire on his palm. "We're gonna find him, darlin'," Grizz said, his voice rough with emotion, a promise forged in steel. "Every single one of us. We're gonna find this bastard." Knuckles was already pulling out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. "I'm calling the chapters," he announced, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Every brother. Every contact. No stone unturned. We find this piece of trash, and we make him wish he'd never seen the light of day." The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't confusion or unease, but a quiet, formidable resolve. The Ironhawks had found their new purpose, etched in the tears of a terrified little girl and the desecration of their sacred mark. The hunt had begun. A tearful confession. The collective gasp that rippled through the Ironhawks clubhouse was thick with a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. Lily, her small chest heaving, buried her face deeper into Grandma Rose's side, fresh tears wetting the old woman's worn denim jacket. The tattoo, a serpentine dragon coiled around a dagger, usually a symbol of fierce loyalty and brotherhood, now felt like a brand of shame, a mark of something unspeakable. Grizz, his face a mask of stone, lowered himself slowly, deliberately, until he was on one knee, level with the little girl. The movement was uncharacteristic, a deliberate softening of his usually imposing presence. His voice, typically a gravelly rumble, was hushed, almost a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile trust Lily had tentatively extended. "Lilybug," he began, the old nickname a tender offering. "Can you tell me more about this bad man?" Lily's small hand, still clutching the fabric of her grandma's shirt, trembled. She lifted her head, her eyes wide and brimming with unshed tears, fixed on Grizz's face. Her lower lip quivered. He had it," she choked out, pointing a tiny accusing finger at the tattoo on Grizz's forearm, the one identical to the club's symbol. Just like that, on his arm. Grandma Rose's arm tightened around Lily, pulling her closer, a silent shield against the burgeoning fear in the room. Her gaze, however, was fixed on Grizz, a silent plea for understanding, for patience. "He hurt me," Lily whispered, the words barely audible, yet they sliced through the stunned silence like a sharpened blade. Her small shoulders shook with the force of her quiet sobs. "And he kept me in a dark place for days." The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. The jovial camaraderie, that had moments ago filled the space had evaporated, replaced by a chilling dread. Grizz's jaw clenched, a muscle working furiously beneath his grizzled beard. His gaze, usually so direct and unwavering, softened further as he looked at Lily. He saw not just a child, but a fragile vessel, bearing a terrible burden. "What did he do, Lily?" Grizz asked, his voice still low, laced with a gentle urgency that belied the fury simmering beneath his calm exterior. He didn't push, didn't demand. He simply offered an open ear, a safe space for her to unburden her small, traumatized heart. Lily sniffed, rubbing her nose with the back of her hand. He made me scared," she confessed, her voice thick with renewed tears. "And other kids were there too. They were scared like me." Her eyes darted around the room, briefly meeting the stern, watchful gazes of the Ironhawks, then quickly retreating back to Grizz's kind, focused face. "He told us we had to be quiet, or he would hurt us more." A low growl rumbled through the chest of one of the younger hawks, quickly silenced by a sharp look from Reaper, the club's sergeant-at-arms. The men, usually boisterous, were unnervingly still, each absorbing the horror of Lily's words. Grandma Rose stroked Lily's hair, her own eyes glistening. "My brave girl," she murmured, kissing the top of Lily's head. "You don't have to tell us everything now, sweet pea. Just what you remember." She looked up at Grizz, her expression a mix of gratitude and raw pain. "It's enough, Grizz. She's been through so much." But Lily, perhaps sensing the shift in the atmosphere, the unspoken vow of protection that now hung heavy in the air, continued, a dam slowly breaking. "He would touch us," she whimpered, her face scrunching up in disgust and fear. "In places that felt bad. And he kept saying he was a friend, because of his mark." She pointed again at Grizz's arm, her small finger lingering near the coiled serpent. He said it meant he was good, but he wasn't. He was bad." The word friend, twisted and corrupted by the predator, hung in the air, a grotesque mockery of its true meaning. The idea that someone would use the Ironhawk's sacred mark, a symbol of loyalty and protection, to gain the trust of innocent children and then inflict such unspeakable harm, ignited a cold, righteous fury within Grizz. He reached out slowly, his large hand gently covering Lily's small one, which still rested on his forearm, near the tattoo. His touch was feather-light, reassuring. "Lily," he said, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of her tears, "that mark on my arm means I will protect you. It means we will find him, and we will stop him." His gaze swept over the grim faces of his brothers, a silent communication passing between them. The hunt was on. The imposter, the desecrator of their symbol, the monster who preyed on children, had just sealed his fate. More than one victim. The silence in the clubhouse was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the dying embers in the hearth. Lily, nestled against Grandma Rose, still trembled, but a fragile thread of defiance had begun to weave itself through her fear. Grizz knelt before them, his usual stone-like expression softened by a raw concern that surprised even his closest brothers. Knuckles, usually quick to interrupt or snort, stood rigid by the wall, his gaze fixed on the little girl. He was nice at first," Lily began, her voice a reedy whisper. She clutched a worn plush rabbit, twisting its ear between her fingers. "He gave me candy, said he knew my daddy, said he was a friend." Her eyes, wide and still too bright with unshed tears, flickered toward Grizz's arm. He had He had your picture. Grizz didn't flinch. He just nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. The hawk, Lily. She nodded, pressing her face into Grandma Rose's side. And the wings. The pointy things under it. She gestured vaguely. He showed it to me. Said it meant he was strong and brave, like a knight. A shudder ran through her small frame. But he wasn't. He wasn't brave at all. The air in the room thickened, a palpable dread settling over the men. They were accustomed to danger, to violence, but this was a different kind of evil, one that struck at the most vulnerable. Knuckles' jaw tightened, a muscle twitching near his ear. He looked at Grizz, a silent question passing between them. What kind of monster uses our colors to lure a child? Did he take you somewhere, Sweet Pea? Grandma Rose asked, her voice a gentle coaxing murmur. She stroked Lily's hair, her gaze unwavering as she looked at Grizz, her eyes pleading for answers he didn't yet have. Lily took a shaky breath. He took me in his truck. It was dark and quiet. She paused, chewing on her lip, a flicker of memory returning to her eyes. But then there was another place. Not dark. It had a window and a tree outside. I saw other kids there too. The casual drop of other kids hit the bikers like a physical blow. Grizz's gaze sharpened, his focus absolute. Other kids, Lily? How many? She shrugged, a tiny, helpless gesture. A few. Some were bigger than me. One girl, she cried all the time, her small brow furrowed in concentration. And another boy. He played with a truck. He didn't look happy. Knuckles let out a low growl, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. The easy camaraderie of the club, usually filled with boisterous laughter and the rumble of engines, was now replaced by a chilling realization. This wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't just about Lily. And the place, Lily, Grizz pressed, his voice even, despite the tempest raging beneath his calm exterior. Was it always the same place? She shook her head, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. No, the window place. It was different from the dark place. And one time, he took me to a place with lots of tall grass. I saw a bird's nest there, with blue eggs. She sniffled. He said not to tell anyone about the eggs, or about him. A collective gasp went through the assembled bikers. The scattered details, innocent in their telling, painted a horrifying picture. Multiple locations, multiple victims, a predator, cunning and methodical, using their club's revered symbol as a cloak of false trust. The desecration of their emblem was a secondary anger, a burning ember beneath the inferno of rage that threatened to consume them. The primary, overwhelming emotion was the visceral need to protect, to avenge. Grizz stood, his eyes sweeping over his brothers. The silent communication was clear. Every man present felt the tremor of impending battle. This wasn't just about finding an imposter. This was about safeguarding their community, about stopping a monster who preyed on innocence, using their very identity as a weapon. Knuckles pushed off the wall, his fists clenching and unclenching. He's been doing this for a while, Grizz, moving them around, covering his tracks. His voice was rough, laced with a dangerous edge. This ain't no one-off. Grandma Rose pulled Lily closer, her eyes blazing with a fierce protectiveness. He needs to be stopped, before he hurts any more children. Her gaze met Grizz's, unwavering. You promised, Grizz. You promised you'd make him pay. Grizz met her gaze, a silent vow passing between them. His eyes, usually guarded, were now alight with a cold, unwavering determination. He looked at his brothers, his voice low, resonating with a steel that silenced all other thoughts. He messed with the wrong family, and he wore the wrong colors. He paused, his gaze returning to Lily, her small, vulnerable figure, a stark reminder of the evil they faced. We find him, we stop him, and then we make him regret every single second he ever used our mark to hurt a child. The air crackled with a renewed energy, no longer just dread, but a potent blend of fury and purpose. The Iron Hawks had a new mission, one that transcended club loyalties and personal vendettas. This was about justice. This was about protecting the innocent. And for Grizz, it was about fulfilling a promise that had become etched into his very soul. The hunt had begun. A tarnished symbol. The silence in the clubhouse was a heavy shroud, thick with unspoken horrors. Lily's small voice, though hushed, had screamed a truth that reverberated in every man present. Grizz, who had been leaning forward, elbows on his knees, slowly straightened. The worn leather of his vest creaked a protest, a small sound in the cavernous room, but his gaze remained fixed on the scarred wooden table. His hands, usually restless, were still, knuckles white where they gripped the edge. Knuckles, typically quick to bark, stood frozen, a half-empty bottle of amber liquid forgotten in his grasp. The glint of the overhead bulb caught the sweat on his brow, a stark contrast to the sudden pallor of his face. He looked from Grizz to the other men, a silent question in his eyes. The realization, a bitter, metallic taste, was settling in. She said, "He had our mark," Knuckles finally rasped, the words thick with disbelief. His voice was a raw edge, slicing through the tension. "Our goddamn patch." A murmur rippled through the gathered men, a low growl of incredulity and dawning fury. The emblem, the soaring hawk with its talons extended, was more than just a symbol. It was their identity, their brotherhood, etched into their skin and sewn onto their backs. To hear it described as a tool for such vile acts was a violation far deeper than any rival gang fight. Grizz finally lifted his head. His eyes, usually a calm, steady gray, were now like flint. "It's an imposter," he stated, his voice a low rumble that nevertheless commanded immediate attention. He didn't shout, didn't rage, but the quiet steel in his tone was more potent than any explosion. "Someone's wearing our colors, using our name." The weight of his words hung in the air, transforming the initial shock into a burning indignation. An imposter, a ghost in their ranks, staining their legacy with unspeakable acts. The irony was a cruel twist. They, the feared Ironhawks, were now unwittingly implicated in a monster's crimes. A wave of shame, hot and unwelcome, washed over several of the men, mingling with their rage. They were outlaws, yes, but they had a code, a brutal honor. This was beyond any line they had ever drawn. Knuckles slammed his bottle onto the table, the thud echoing in the sudden quiet. "Wearing our colors? He's spitting on every damn one of us." His face was a mask of fury, a vein throbbing at his temple. His gaze swept the room, meeting the equally enraged eyes of his brothers. "This ain't just about protecting a kid anymore, Grizz. This is about what's ours. Our name." Grizz nodded slowly, his jaw tight. The protection of Lily was paramount, a visceral need that had surged the moment he understood her fear. But Knuckles was right. This went deeper. The symbol of the Iron Hawks, forged in sweat and loyalty, was being twisted into a perverted emblem of terror. "She saw other kids," Grizz reminded them, his voice gaining a hard edge. "Multiple places. This isn't a one-off. This bastard has been doing this, and he's been using us as his shield. The implications were horrifying. How many children had looked at that familiar hawk, seen a semblance of authority, and been led astray? How many parents might now look at an iron hawk, at Grizz, and see the face of evil? The anger in the room intensified, a palpable force that seemed to vibrate the very walls. The initial confusion had dissipated, replaced by a cold, unwavering resolve. They were no longer just angry. They were hunting. Knuckles paced a tight circle, his heavy boots thudding on the wooden floor. So, what now? We find this sick son of a bitch. We rip that patch off him and then... His voice trailed off, but the unspoken promise of brutal retribution hung heavy in the air. Grizz pushed himself away from the table, his formidable frame casting a long shadow across the room. He walked to the window, his back to the others, staring out at the inky blackness beyond. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, mirroring the contorted reality they now faced. He thought of Lily's small, trembling hand, her innocent finger pointing at his tattoo. The horror wasn't just that someone was using their symbol. The horror was that it worked, that a child, desperate for trust, had been deceived by a lie woven from their very identity. He turned, his face etched with a grim determination that silenced the room once more. "We find him," Grizz said, his voice low, a promise of retribution echoing through the clubhouse. "And when we do, he'll wish he'd never worn that goddamn patch." His gaze lingered on each man, a silent challenge, a call to arms. The Iron Hawks were feared, but they were also bound by an unwavering code. And now, that code demanded justice, not just for Lily, but for the sacred symbol they wore. The Iron Hawks' vow. A low growl rippled through the clubhouse, a collective sound of outrage and a hunger for retribution that vibrated in the very floorboards. The air, thick with the scent of stale beer and simmering anger, crackled with an unspoken resolve. Knuckles, his usually jovial face contorted into a mask of pure fury, slammed a fist onto the scarred oak table. The impact made a few empty glasses jump. "This ain't just about protecting our name," he bit out, his voice a low rumble that silenced the last murmurs. "This is about protecting kids. Our kids. Any kid." The sea of weathered faces around him mirrored his intensity. These were men who lived by a code, a brutal, unwritten law that valued loyalty and protection above all else. To have their symbol, their very identity, twisted into a tool of such vile depravity was an affront to everything they stood for. The idea of an imposter, a wolf in their sheep's clothing, preying on the most vulnerable, ignited a firestorm within them. "He used our colors," another voice, deep and gravelly, cut through the tension. "He wore our patch. He made that little girl think he was one of us." The last words hung in the air, heavy with self-condemnation, and a burning need to purge this stain. Grizz, who had remained silent, observing the storm brewing around him, finally pushed himself away from the wall. His gaze swept over his brothers, each man meeting his eyes with unwavering determination. "We find him," he stated, his voice a low, steady current in the torrent of emotion. "We find him, and we stop him. Permanently." There was no need for further explanation, no debate. The decision was unanimous, solidified in the grim set of their jaws and the hardened glint in their eyes. The Iron Hawks, once a force to be feared for their ruthlessness, were now unified by a different kind of mission: redemption. He turned, his heavy boots echoing on the concrete, as he walked towards the small huddle of figures near the flickering television screen. Lily, still nestled against Grandma Rose, looked up as he approached. Her eyes, wide and apprehensive, held a flicker of the terror that had consumed her. Grandma Rose tightened her arm around the child, her own face etched with worry, but also a fierce, unyielding strength. Grizz knelt down, bringing himself to Lily's eye level. The rough leather of his vest creaked softly. He removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that, for all their usual sternness, now held a deep, uncharacteristic sincerity. "Lily," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "The bad man, he won't hurt you again, or anyone else." He paused, searching for the right words, a language of comfort he rarely used. "We're going to find him, and we're going to make sure he can't ever do bad things again." Lily blinked, her small hand instinctively reaching for Grandma Rose's sleeve. She searched Grizz's face, a silent question in her gaze. He held her stare, a silent promise passing between them. He felt a profound weight settle in his chest, a vow etched not just in words, but in the very core of his being. Grandma Rose, her eyes moist but firm, nodded slowly. "You promise, Grizz?" she asked, her voice quiet but unwavering. "You promise to protect her? To protect others?" Grizz met her gaze, his own unwavering. "I promise, Rose," he said, the words heavy with conviction. "On my life, and on the lives of every man in this club." He glanced back at his brothers, who stood in a silent phalanx behind him, their grim faces testament to their shared resolve. "We will not rest until he's found and stopped." A tiny, almost imperceptible nod from Lily was his answer, a fragile spark of trust in her innocent eyes. As Grizz stood, the transformation within the clubhouse was palpable. The heavy silence that had followed Lily's revelation had given way to a focused energy. Maps were pulled out, spread across tables, their topographical lines a canvas for the looming hunt. Phones were already buzzing, the initial calls for information going out to their network, a web that stretched far beyond the confines of their immediate territory. Knuckles, his anger now channeled into sharp, decisive action, was already delegating tasks, his voice a low, urgent murmur. The roar of engines would soon shatter the night, not in defiance of the law, but in pursuit of a justice more primal, more absolute than any courtroom could deliver. The Iron Hawks, once symbols of fear, were now instruments of protection, fueled by a collective rage and a solemn vow. They would hunt, they would find, and they would make sure that the man who had dared to wear their colors in such a vile act would face a reckoning that transcended the bounds of human law. For Lily, for Grandma Rose, and for every child who had fallen victim, their hunt had begun. The hunt begins. The roar of engines filled the stale air of the clubhouse garage, a cacophony of chrome and horsepower that usually signaled a ride to blow off steam. Tonight it was a battle cry. Knuckles, his face grim under the dim fluorescence, paced before the assembled Iron Hawks. "All right, listen up. We got a rat wearing our colors, tainting everything we stand for. This ain't about territory or respect. This is about a child, about children." His voice was a low growl, the kind that promised pain. "Grizz and I are running point. No solo missions, no loose cannons. Every piece of info comes back here, to me or Grizz. Understood?" A chorus of guttural affirmations met his command. Grizz, leaning against a grease-stained workbench, surveyed the eager faces. Each man, a hardened veteran of countless street battles, now bristled with a different kind of fury. This wasn't about upholding their fearsome reputation. It was about reclaiming their honor. about protecting the innocent. He met Knuckles' gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The plan was simple, brutal, and effective. Flood the streets, squeeze every informant, every connection, every shadow, until their prey was flushed out. Lily described him as having a faded tattoo, not as crisp as ours. Grizz finally spoke, his voice surprisingly calm, despite the storm brewing within. And he drove a beat-up sedan, dark blue or black, older model. Knuckles slammed a fist onto a nearby oil drum. That's our starting point. Buzz, take your crew. Hit the docks. There's always shady deals and loose lips down there. Ask about anyone fitting that description, particularly if they've been seen hanging around kids. Snake, you and your boys, sweep the transient camps, the abandoned warehouses. That's where scum like this often hides. The club members, a wave of leather and denim, began to disperse. Harleys rumbled to life, each departure a tremor in the concrete floor. The air thickened with the scent of exhaust and righteous anger. Grizz watched them go, a silent promise etched into his features. He felt the weight of Lily's trusting eyes, the fragile hope in Grandma Rose's tear-streaked face. This wasn't just a hunt. It was a sacred trust. Knuckles turned to Grizz, running a hand over his shaved head. He's cunning, this bastard. Operating under our banner, that takes a special kind of twisted courage. Or desperation, Grizz countered, pushing off the workbench. He thought our reputation would shield him, make him invisible. He underestimated us. He pulled on his gloves, the leather creaking softly. Lily said he gave her candy, talked to her. He cultivated trust. A wolf in sheep's clothing, wearing a hawk's feather. Knuckles spat. We'll tear him apart. He pulled out a worn map of the city, spreading it across the workbench. We need to focus on areas with schools, parks, anywhere kids congregate. Think about patterns, places he could easily blend in and disappear. Grizz pointed to a cluster of low-income housing projects on the map's eastern edge. He targeted vulnerable kids. That's where he'd find them. And the sedan. It's anonymous. He wouldn't want something flashy. Knuckles nodded. Right, I'll get some of the younger prospects to canvass those neighborhoods. They can talk to the kids, ask if anyone's seen a man with a tattoo like ours, driving a dark sedan, offering treats. He paused, his expression hardening. Make it clear they're not to approach him. Just report back. The hours blurred into a relentless pursuit. Phone calls buzzed, reports trickled in, each fragment of information carefully weighed. A lead from Buzz at the docks mentioned a man fitting the description, buying cheap fuel from a back alley dealer. He had a nervous habit of looking over his shoulder. Another report from Snake's crew talked about a dilapidated sedan, seen idling near a deserted playground on the city's outskirts. The details were sparse, disjointed, but they began to form a hazy outline of their target. Grizz and Knuckles rode out themselves, a silent vanguard, covering ground that their men hadn't yet reached. The city, usually a familiar labyrinth, now felt like a hunting ground. Every shadowed alleyway, every parked car, every fleeting glimpse of a figure in the periphery sparked a jolt of adrenaline. Grizz's eyes, usually watchful but calm, now scanned with an almost predatory intensity. He felt a primal shift within him, a reversion to something ancient and fierce. The civilized veneer had cracked, revealing the protector, the avenger. As dusk settled, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, they found themselves cruising past a forgotten community center, its paint peeling, its windows boarded up. A lone, tattered basketball hoop, stood sentinel in the cracked asphalt lot, a place where innocence might once have thrived, now just decay. Grizz slowed his bike, his gaze fixed on a faint tire track leading off the main road towards the rear of the building. It was fresh, distinct, and left by a smaller vehicle than their Harleys. Knuckles followed his line of sight. "What is it, Grizz?" Grizz didn't answer immediately. He dismounted, his boots crunching on loose gravel. The silence of the abandoned lot was punctuated only by the distant hum of city traffic. He walked towards the tire track, crouching down, his fingers tracing the faint indentation in the dust. The pattern was subtle, but he recognized it from Lily's frantic description. The specific tread of an older model sedan. He stood, his jaw tight. "He's been here." The words were a low growl, barely audible above the cooling engine of his bike. "He's still around." Following the scent, the rumble of the bikes cut through the morning chill, a restless, predatory sound. Grizz led the charge, his eyes scanning every alleyway, every shadowed doorway, a grim set to his jaw. Knuckles, riding close behind, kept his gaze peeled for anything out of place. A twitch in a curtain, a lingering shadow, a car that didn't belong. The community center had been a cold trail, the sedan long gone, but it had given them a direction, a scent. Now, they were dogs on the hunt, their senses sharpened by a primal need for retribution. Their first stop was a greasy spoon on the edge of the industrial district, a place where information often flowed as freely as the lukewarm coffee. Grizz parked his Road King, its chrome glinting dully in the overcast light. Inside, the air hung thick with the smell of stale grease and cigarette smoke. A few grizzled regulars hunched over chipped mugs, their eyes following the bikers with a mix of fear and respect. "Mornin', Pops," Grizz rumbled, sliding onto a worn stool at the counter. The proprietor, a man with a perpetually tired face and a faded apron, nodded a greeting. "Grizz, Knuckles, what brings you boys to my humble establishment so early?" Pops asked, already pouring 2 steaming cups. "Looking for a ghost," Knuckles replied, taking a gulp of coffee. "Someone's been wearing our colors, doing things that ain't right. Seen anyone new around? Anyone out of place?" Pops wiped down the counter slowly, his gaze drifting to the street outside. "Lots of new faces these days, Grizz. Hard to keep track. But..." There was a fella. Drove a dark sedan, late model. Looked too clean for this part of town, kept to himself. Came in a few times, always ordered the same. Black coffee, plain donut. Didn't talk much, just watched the street. Had a peculiar way of looking at kids playing outside. Grizz exchanged a look with Knuckles. "When was this?" "Last week, maybe a few days ago. Haven't seen him since." Pops paused, then leaned in conspiratorially. "He parked that sedan in front of the old abandoned warehouse down the street sometimes. Said he was looking for a new place to store inventory." Pops gave a knowing wink, implying something illicit. "Thanks, Pops." Grizz tossed a few crumpled bills onto the counter. More than enough for the coffee. The old warehouse was a skeletal monument to forgotten industry. Its windows shattered, its corrugated metal walls rusting. The wind whistled through the gaps, carrying the smell of damp earth and decay. They circled the perimeter, their eyes peeling for any sign of recent activity. Dust lay thick on everything, disturbed only by the tracks of rodents and the occasional stray dog. No fresh tire marks, no footprints, another dead end. He's smart," Knuckles muttered, kicking a loose stone. "Doesn't leave much behind." "He's good at what he does," Grizz agreed, his voice tight. "Which means we gotta be better." Their next lead came from a young punk named Sparky, a low-level dealer who owed the club a favor. They found him huddled in a grimy alcove behind a liquor store, shivering despite the mild air. "Sparky, we need a name." Knuckles cut straight to the chase. Sparky stammered, his eyes darting nervously. "Name? What for?" "A ghost," Grizz reiterated, his voice a low growl that made Sparky flinch. A man who preys on the innocent wears a mark that ain't his. Dark sedan. Been around these parts. Sparky fidgeted, rubbing his hands together. "There's talk of a new guy. Goes by the Professor. Real quiet, smart looking, glasses, dresses neat. But there's something off about him. Heard he's been offering candy, little toys, to kids around the park, trying to get 'em to go with him. Said he needed help finding a lost pet." A cold knot tightened in Grizz's gut. "The park? Which park?" "The one by the old library, down on Elm Street. Saw his sedan there just yesterday, parked kinda hidden behind some bushes. Real dark tint on the windows." Sparky's voice dropped to a whisper. "Heard a kid crying in the back seat once, then it went quiet real fast." The information hit them like a physical blow. The park, the library, the quiet crying. It all fit. "You done good, Sparky," Grizz said, his voice devoid of its usual gruffness. He tossed a $20 bill at the kid. "You see him again, you call. Understand?" Sparky nodded vigorously, stuffing the money into his pocket. The ride to Elm Street was a blur of controlled aggression. The Iron Hawks moved as one, a storm cloud descending. The park was a sprawling expanse of worn grass and rusty playground equipment. Parents pushed strollers, kids shrieked with laughter, completely oblivious to the predator lurking in their midst. The dark sedan, just as Sparky described, was parked discreetly, half hidden by a cluster of overgrown rhododendrons. Grizz pulled his bike to a silent halt, his eyes fixed on the car. Knuckles dismounted, his hand already on the grip of the wrench tucked into his belt. This wasn't just a lead. This was a live wire. The imposter was here now, in their territory, still hunting. The air crackled with a dangerous energy, a silent promise of swift, brutal justice. They had followed the scent, and it had led them right to the edge of the abyss. The hunt was over. The confrontation was about to begin. Cornered. The oppressive summer night pressed in, thick and humid, as Grizz steered his Harley down the crumbling access road. Dust, thick as talcum powder, plumed from beneath the tires of the club's converging vehicles, painting the air in a hazy red-tinged glow from their taillights. Ahead, the skeletal silhouette of the old abandoned warehouse, a monument to forgotten industry, clawed at the bruised sky. Its broken windows, like vacant eyes, stared out from the rust-streaked concrete. "This is it," Knuckles grunted, pulling his hog alongside Grizz. The words were unnecessary. The grim set of his jaw and the tight grip on his handlebars spoke volumes. He'd scouted this location hours ago, the scent of stale urine and rotting wood practically clinging to his report. Lily's description had been specific enough, combined with the other leads, to narrow it down to this desolate place. The professor, as they'd come to call him, had been using a series of derelict structures, his twisted classrooms. This one, judging by the recent tracks, was his current sanctuary. They dismounted, the throaty rumble of the engines fading into the chirping chorus of crickets. The air, heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay, hung stagnant. A crescent moon offered little illumination, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with every rustle of dry weeds. The Iron Hawks fanned out, their movements practiced, silent. Each man a shadow within shadows. their faces grim, resolved. Grizz led the charge towards a gaping maw in the warehouse's side, a bay door long since ripped from its hinges. The interior was a cavern of inky blackness, punctuated by slivers of moonlight piercing through the shattered roof. The air inside was colder, thick with the metallic tang of rust and the cloying sweetness of rot. Every creak of the aging structure, every skittering rodent amplified the tension. "Stay sharp," Grizz rumbled, his voice a low growl that seemed to absorb the dust in the air. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of the hunting knife sheathed at his hip. Knuckles, a silent sentinel at his side, gripped a heavy wrench, its chrome glinting faintly in the gloom. A muffled thud echoed from deeper within the building. Not a rat, not the wind. "He's here," Knuckles whispered, his eyes narrowing, scanning the oppressive darkness. The scent of fear, subtle but distinct, mingled with the decay. It was a smell Grizz knew well, a predator's fear, not a victim's. They moved like wraiths, their boots crunching on broken glass and loose debris. The warehouse was a labyrinth of forgotten machinery, rusted cranes and stacked crates, all draped in a thick shroud of dust and cobwebs. Grizz's gaze swept across the cavernous space, his senses heightened, every nerve alive. He caught a flicker of movement near a skeletal catwalk high above. "Up there," he hissed, pointing. A figure, small and hunched, darted across the catwalk, momentarily silhouetted against a sliver of moonlight. The Professor. He was quicker than Grizz had anticipated, scrambling with a panicked energy. The chase was on. "Split up!" Knuckles roared, his voice bouncing off the concrete walls. "Cut him off!" The Ironhawks dispersed, their heavy boots thudding a rhythmic counterpoint to the professor's frantic scrabbling. The warehouse became a terrifying echo chamber, a symphony of pursuit. Grizz pushed himself harder, his muscles burning, his focus unwavering. He imagined Lily's tear-streaked face, her small finger pointing. The rage, cold and steady, fueled his every stride. The professor, clearly familiar with the building's layout, used the obstacles to his advantage, ducking behind columns, weaving through stacks of equipment. But the Hawks knew how to hunt. They were relentless, a wave of primal justice. One of the brothers, a burly man named Reaper, emerged from behind a towering pile of crates, effectively cutting off the professor's escape route towards a broken loading dock. Cornered, the professor scrambled up a narrow, rickety staircase, leading to a small, enclosed office, perched precariously above the main floor. The metal groaned under his weight, threatening to give way. Grizz and Knuckles were right behind him, their heavy breathing the only sound besides the professor's desperate gasps. "Nowhere left to run, Professor," Grizz growled, his voice low and dangerous as they reached the landing. The small office was barely more than a cage, its single window boarded up. The air within was thick with the scent of stale fear and unwashed body. The man, smaller than Grizz had imagined from the descriptions, spun around, his eyes wide and wild, like a trapped animal. He was nondescript, almost forgettable, save for the dark, swirling tattoo on his forearm, the Ironhawk's emblem, twisted and defiled. It was a grotesque parody, mocking their very existence. "Please," the professor whimpered, his voice reedy, cracking. He held up his hands, trembling, a pathetic plea. I didn't mean any harm." Knuckles stepped forward, his face a mask of cold fury. The wrench in his hand felt impossibly heavy. "Didn't mean any harm?" he scoffed, his voice laced with venom. "You used our mark. You preyed on children. You think that's no harm?" Grizz watched the man's eyes dart between him and Knuckles, searching for an escape that wasn't there. The rest of the club had converged below, Their silent presence a crushing weight. The professor was truly cornered, his reign of terror at an end. The only light in the grimy office came from the slivers, filtering through the boarded window, illuminating the fear etched on his face. Justice, brutal and uncompromising, had finally found its mark. Safety and smiles. The professor, a small, trembling figure, was secured with industrial zip ties to a rusty support beam. His eyes darted wildly, fear a raw, pungent odor in the stagnant air. Grizz stood over him. Oh, mountain of quiet fury. Who else knows? His voice was a low rumble, the kind that vibrates through the bones. The professor whimpered, shaking his head. No one. Just me. I swear. Knuckles, ever practical, was already on his phone, relaying their location and the situation to the authorities. His words were clipped, precise, cutting through the tense silence. We have a suspect. Male, mid-40s, defiled Ironhawk's tattoo. Identity unknown. Charges: abduction, assault, and God knows what else. He paused, listening. No, we've contained him. He's not going anywhere. He glanced at Grizz, a silent acknowledgement of the grim work done. The rest of the club members, their faces grim, kept a watchful perimeter, their presence a solid wall of deterrence against any lingering shadows. Grizz knelt, bringing his face level with the professor's. You used our mark, he said, the words heavy with disgust. You shamed us. The professor flinched, shrinking further into himself. There was no remorse in the man's eyes, just a desperate, animalistic terror. That was enough for Grizz. Justice, in this moment, wasn't about vengeance. It was about stopping the poison. When the police cruisers finally arrived, their flashing lights slicing through the gloom of the warehouse, Grizz gave a succinct account, pointing out the secured professor. He offered no excuses for their presence, no elaborate explanations. The officers, recognizing the Ironhawk's emblem and the seriousness of the situation, handled the transfer with a professionalism that bordered on wary respect. They knew a line had been crossed, a debt paid, and that some debts were best settled outside the usual channels. As the professor was led away, his pathetic pleas echoing in the vast space, Grizz felt a knot in his stomach loosen, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. The immediate threat was neutralized. Now, it was time for the real work. Healing. He left Knuckles to handle the remaining details with the police, promising to meet up later. The roar of his Harley beneath him was a familiar comfort, a rhythmic pulse against the lingering adrenaline. The ride back to the diner was a blur of streetlights and passing cars. His mind singularly focused on two things: Lily and Grandma Rose. The diner was still bathed in the warm glow of its neon sign, a beacon of normalcy in a world that had been anything but. Grizz pushed open the door, the familiar scent of coffee and sizzling bacon washing over him. Grandma Rose sat at the counter, a half-empty mug of tea before her, her gaze fixed on the entrance. Lily was curled up in a booth, her small body barely visible over the tabletop, a picture book clutched in her hands. The moment Grandma Rose saw him, a wave of relief washed over her face, softening the worry etched around her eyes. She pushed herself up, her movements stiff. "Grizz," she breathed, her voice thick with unspent anxiety. He nodded, a silent reassurance. He didn't need to speak. She read the answer in his steady gaze, the way his shoulders, though still broad and powerful, seemed to carry a lighter burden. Lily, hearing her name, peeked over the top of her book. Her eyes, wide and still shadowed with fear, met his. She didn't smile, not yet, but the rigid tension in her small frame seemed to lessen fractionally. Grizz walked over to the booth, his heavy boots making soft thuds on the checkered floor. He slid into the opposite seat, the vinyl groaning under his weight. He looked at Lily, then at Grandma Rose, who had joined them, her hand resting protectively on Lily's head. "He's gone," Grizz said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it, stripped of its usual gruffness. He looked directly at Lily, his eyes conveying a truth that words alone couldn't capture. The bad man. He won't ever hurt anyone again. Lily's breath hitched. She stared at him, her small mouth slightly open. The words seemed to hang in the air, slowly permeating the fear that had encased her for so long. Then, very slowly, a tiny tremor began at the corners of her mouth. It spread hesitantly at first, then blossoming into a full, radiant smile. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated relief, a sunshine breaking through a storm. Her whole face lit up, and for the first time since the ordeal began, the heavy burden of terror seemed to lift from her small shoulders. Grandma Rose let out a shaky breath, tears welling in her own eyes. She pulled Lily into a fierce hug, pressing kisses into her granddaughter's hair. "Oh, my sweet girl," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's over. You're safe." Lily giggled, a sound like wind chimes, a sound that Grizz hadn't realized he'd been so desperate to hear. She pulled back from her grandmother, her smile still wide, her eyes sparkling with a newfound lightness. She looked at Grizz, her expression one of utter trust and gratitude. "Thank you, Grizz," she said, her voice clear and strong. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling more profound than any rush of adrenaline or the satisfaction of a fight won. He simply nodded, unable to articulate the depth of his own relief. This was why they did what they did. For this. For the safety. For the smiles. For the innocent who deserved to live without fear. The Iron Hawks had reclaimed their honor, not with fists and fury, but with a quiet act of primal justice delivered for a child.